On a quiet evening in September 2006, in a small village called Khairlanji in Maharashtra, the day ended the way it always had. Fields went dark, homes shut their doors, and the village settled into an eerie, calm silence. This was not a place where violence was loud. It was a place where it was inherited, normalized, and carefully ignored. But what happened next that evening did not unfold in secrecy or darkness. It happened in full view, sustained by silence, protected by power, and followed by denial. When the night finally passed, 4 lives were gone, and the system moved faster to erase the crime than to confront it. For weeks, the story barely made it beyond the village borders. And when it finally did, it forced the nation to look at something deeply uncomfortable. Not just the crime itself, but everything that made it possible. This is not just the story of a massacre, it's the story of complicity and what happens when justice is decided long before a crime is ever committed. This is the story of the Khairlanji Massacre. Hi everyone, welcome to the Desi Crime Podcast, a show where we dive deep into some of the craziest cases from around South Asia. I'm your host Aishwarya.
And I'm Aryaan.
And the case that I have for you today is one of our most tragically heartbreaking ones.
As you told me about the nature of this crime without sort of revealing a lot, and it's one of the first cases of this nature that we have covered on the podcast. I don't want to give away more, but it's one that I think we as a country systemically grapple with. And I'm glad that it's the first time we're covering it on Desi Crime. I haven't heard of the case, but from whatever little you told me about it, I know it's going to address something very difficult.
And I'm glad it's finally getting addressed on the podcast. Obviously, there's more than enough cases of this kind from the country. But I think this one really went on to epitomize the struggle of the community and became sort of this war cry and this battle cry for people from that community to try and cause change finally. So I'm glad that this can be the story that we put out to have this conversation. On the 30th September 2006, the dawn light revealed a horrifying sight on the outskirts of Keralanji. In the shallow village canal, a bloated body floated face down. As police officers and villagers gathered, they realized it was the body of a teenage girl, naked and brutalized beyond belief. A lone man waded into the muddy water to pull her out. Bhaiyalal Bhotmange, the girl's father. He had spent the entire night desperately searching for his missing family, and now he stared in mute agony at the lifeless remains of his 17-year-old daughter, Priyanka. Her body was covered head to toe in bruises, swollen and discolored. Not an inch of her skin was spared injury, as one observer later noted. Villagers whispered in shock, but many averted their eyes. Priyanka's once bright face, a top student who had dreams beyond this little hamlet, was now unrecognizable. Her long hair fanned out in the blood-tinged water as Bhaiyalal helped lift her onto the banks, his hands trembling. He gently cradled her battered head, the reality setting in that his beloved daughter was gone in the most horrible way imaginable. The September air was already warm, but Bhaiyalal felt an icy chill as he noticed something that made his stomach churn. Wooden sticks and metal rods protruding from Priyanka's mutilated body from between her legs. It was evidence of the absolutely inhumane cruelty inflicted on her. Not far away, 3 more bodies were soon found near the same canal. Surekha, who's 45, Priyanka's mother, was discovered naked and beaten just like her daughter. Nearby lay Sudhir, who was 21, and Roshan, 19, Surekha's sons and Priyanka's older brothers. The 2 young men's bodies bore horrific injuries, bloodied and broken limbs, faces smashed beyond recognition. Roshan's eyes were open in a vacant stare. He was partially blind in life, and in death, it looked as if he had cried for mercy that never came. Sudhir's hands were contorted, possibly from a futile attempt to fight back or shield himself. Both brothers' genitals had been mutilated savagely too. All 4 family members had clearly been tortured before they were killed. Villagers murmured that the mother and daughter had been paraded naked, gang and then murdered, and that the sons had been forced to witness unimaginable horrors before they too were slaughtered. But at this early hour on September 30th, 2006, the truth of what happened that night before was only beginning to emerge. Bhaiyalal stood over the bodies of his wife, daughter, and sons in stunned silence. Just hours ago, they were his entire world, his family, Dalit farmers who had lived quietly on the edge of this village. And now they were gone, reduced to cold corpses on the canal bank. A low wail escaped his throat as the weight of his loss became real. The policemen on scene exchanged uneasy glances. They had never seen a crime of this savagery in their region. Even in a country unfortunately familiar with caste violence, the Khairlanji Massacre, as it was soon going to be known, stood out for its depravity. For Bhaiyalal, it felt like the world had ended. He was the sole survivor of what had been a happy family just 24 hours ago. Now, as he collapsed to his knees before Priyanka's battered body, all he could do was let out a howl of anguish that echoed across the silent fields. Little did the world know, the events of this night would soon ignite statewide fury and expose the ugly underbelly of caste hatred in 21st century India. But at that moment, on the canal's edge, there was only grief, horror, and the question, how could this have happened? To understand the Khairlanji massacre, one must understand Khairlanji village itself. It was a small, unremarkable settlement in the Bhandara district of Maharashtra, a cluster of fewer than 200 families living in brick huts and modest cement houses amid flat, dusty farmlands. Life in Khairlanji was hard, but typical of rural India. Yet beneath its ordinary surface lurked an extraordinary tension. Keralanji was a village divided by caste. The Bhotmange family were Dalits, members of the scheduled castes historically treated as untouchables. Specifically, they belonged to the Mahar caste, followers of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's legacy, many of whom had converted to Buddhism decades earlier to escape Hindu caste oppression. In Khairlanji, Dalits were a tiny minority, only 3 Dalit families in the entire village. The overwhelming majority of Khairlanji's residents were from dominant agrarian castes classified as other backward classes, or the OBC, particularly the Kumbi and related Maratha subcastes. These OBC communities had themselves known hardship historically, but in local hierarchy, they stood far above the Dalits. Over generations, they had come to own most of the land and power in the village. Dalits, on the other hand, typically worked as labourers and remained landless or with very small holdings. The Bhotmanges were an exception though. Surekha and her husband Bhaiyalal had managed to retain 5 acres of farmland, making them landowners in their own right. This was highly unusual for a Dalit family, and it did not sit well with some of their upper caste neighbours. And indeed, land was at the core of the simmering tensions. Years earlier, in the 1990s, part of the Bhotmanges' land had been forcibly taken by the village council to build a road. That 2-acre slice was gone and no compensation given. Still, the family held on to the remaining plot stubbornly. They began cultivating it, and Surekha dreamed of eventually building a pakka or a permanent brick house on their land, a concrete symbol that her family had risen from poverty. But each attempt by the Bhotmanges to assert themselves met with hostility from powerful villagers. When Surekha tried to construct a brick house, a village head and other locals objected. A Dalit untouchable family, they felt, did not deserve a sturdy home on par with others and didn't let the family build one. Neighbours routinely hurled caste-based abuses daily at Surekha and her daughter, reminding them of their low status. In fact, epithets targeting Dalit women's sexuality were routine in the past and were used against these two too to keep them in their place. In Khairlanji's feudal social order, assertive Dalit women in particular were seen as a threat, and Surekha, a proud 45-year-old mother, was certainly assertive. She refused to be cowed by the taunts and filed police complaints when harassed. In response to her assertion of her rights, she was even attacked with a sickle by some village women from the higher caste, a violent warning for her to know her place. Surekha reported this assault, and a record of it sat at the local police station, though little was done to hold the attackers accountable. Life for the Bhotmange family had become a daily gauntlet of intimidation. Despite the harassment though, Surekha encouraged her children to excel and not feel ashamed of who they were. Her eldest son Sudhir was visually impaired from childhood, yet he was determined to help on the farm and be independent. The younger son, Roshan, was the family's gentle soul, always by his brother's side. And then there was Priyanka, the bright star of the family. At 17, Priyanka was in class 12 and had been a school topper, scoring high marks in her 10th grade exams. She nursed ambitions of going to college, perhaps one day even winning a scholarship to a big university in a big city. In a village where most Dalit girls barely finished school, Priyanka's academic success was a beacon. But in the twisted logic of caste bigotry, Priyanka's achievements only fueled more resentment among some of the dominant caste villagers. How dare a Dalit girl outshine their children? How dare she dream beyond the menial life prescribed to her by her tradition? By September 2006, tension hung thick in the air in Khairlanji. Beneath the superficial peace of rural life, ugly grudges festered. The Bhotmange's land remained a point of contention. There were renewed murmurs in the village about routing another road or irrigation channels through their fields, which Surekha firmly opposed. The daily verbal abuse continued unfettered, creating an atmosphere of terror for the family. Surekha often had to reassure her children to stay strong. She would tell them that as Buddhists and as Dalits, they had equal rights in free India, a belief she held with fierce conviction. However, within the village, the Bhotmanges had virtually no allies. The only other two Dalit families were themselves terrified of retaliation and kept a low profile. Surrounded by hostility, Surekha sought help from an outsider. This decision would set in motion the chain of events leading to an absolute bloodbath. In her fight to protect her family's land and dignity, Surekha Bhotmange turned to a family friend from a nearby village. His name was Siddharth Gajbhiye, and he was Dalit like them, someone who understood their struggles, but crucially, someone who held the position of a police patil in his village. A police patil is a local village official who assists the police, essentially a liaison between the community and law enforcement. With his knowledge of the law and a little bit of influence, Siddharth was exactly the ally that Surekha needed. Whenever Surekha needed, Siddharth began advising the Bhotmanges on their rights and even intervened when villagers tried to encroach on their land. Many in Khairlanji viewed Siddharth as an outsider meddling in their internal affairs. Worse, he was a Dalit outsider who dared to challenge OBC men on their behalf. This would not be tolerated for long, the community had decided. Tensions over Siddharth's intervention finally boiled over on September 3rd, 2006. According to police records and witness statements, a confrontation occurred that day between Siddharth and some Khairlanji villagers. The spark is disputed. Some say Siddharth was accosted over the land issue. Others claim it was a baseless, salacious rumor that Siddharth had an illicit affair with Surekha, a claim spread to inflame hatred against both of them. On that day, the mob accused Siddharth of improper relations with Surekha and seized upon it as justification for violence. They beat him with sticks and fists, leaving him bloodied. It could have been fatal, but Surekha and Priyanka intervened. Hearing the commotion, the mother and daughter rushed to the scene, despite the danger to themselves. They found Siddharth on the ground, being thrashed, when Priyanka, just 17, fearlessly threw herself over Siddharth to shield him, while Surekha shouted at the attackers to stop. Perhaps surprised by the women's defiance, the mob backed off momentarily. The Bhotmange women managed to lift Siddharth and half drag, half carried their injured friend away from the frenzy. Under a barrage of insults like Dalit whores, traitors, they took him to the safety of the Bhotmange home and then later to a hospital. The assault on Siddharth was a turning point. Surekha was furious. This time, she was determined to make the attackers face the law. Once Siddharth was in the hospital, he and the Bhotmanges filed a formal police complaint at the Andalgaon police station, the jurisdiction of Khairlanji, where they named 15 attackers in their complaint, recounting how a mob led by influential villagers had beaten Siddharth without provocation. Initially, the local police were reluctant, as always, to register a case. One of Siddharth's brothers went to the station to report the incident and was turned away by officers who likely didn't want to escalate a caste confrontation in their area. It was only after Siddharth's injuries were documented in the hospital, providing undeniable evidence of the beating, that the police finally registered an FIR days later. The case, crime number 52/06, charged the named villagers with assault. Surekha and Priyanka gave detailed statements identifying many of the assailants, and among those named were men from the Khavar, Dhande, Pinjewar, and Manlekar families, surnames belonging to the dominant Kumbi OBC communities in Khairlanji. Some of these men were well connected politically too. In fact, one of the prime suspects, Bhaskar Kadav, was related to a local politician and known in the village for his aggressive stance towards Dalits. But this time, with pressure from Dalit activists in the district, the police were compelled to act. Within days, they arrested 12 men out of the 15 accused for the assault on Siddharth. For the first time, it seemed that the law might deliver justice for the Bhutmanges. Surekha and Priyanka's courageous testimony had put powerful men behind bars, even if only temporarily. But that small victory came at a price. Khairlanji's dominant caste community seethed with anger at two Dalit women who had dared to speak against them. In their eyes, Surekha and her daughter had betrayed the village's caste order by going to the police. And to make matters worse for the accused, the case against them, though a bailable offence of assault, had actually landed them in jail for a few weeks.
Aishwarya, of course, this case is going into a direction where it's only going to get gruesome. But at this stage, the police seems to be more cooperative than I would have thought.
Sure.
Is that normal? Or I'm kind of surprised as to why the police in that area is not just sort of going along with the narrative of the village's elite, so to say.
I think Siddharth's injuries, because they got documented at the hospital, because Surekha created some hue and cry, and because there were enough Dalit families in the community for activists to keep an eye out, and people kind of raised alarm, the police had to end up acting. But you'll see what it means for the police to act in an initial moment to appease activists and then to let people out. The consequences of that are so much worse.
Interesting.
They're actually following through with justice the right way. So there's not much happens. I mean, jail for 2 weeks is not it for beating a man blue.
It's almost worse, you are saying.
It's almost worse, yeah. So like I said, those men who had now been behind bars for a few weeks were filled with rage, vowing revenge. The village grapevine buzzed with talk that the Bhutmange family would face consequences once the men were out, and it wasn't idle gossip. Chillingly, even as the legal wheels turned, there were reports that some local officials and politicians were working behind the scenes, not to protect the Dalit family, but to help the accused. A member of Legislative Assembly from the area, Madhukar Kukare, was later alleged to have tried to influence the investigation in favor of the attackers. Kukare denied it, but the state's own inquiry would implicate multiple police officers and doctors in an attempted cover-up in the weeks ahead. For most of September 2006, the accused men remain in custody, awaiting a bail hearing, all while Surekha and Priyanka continued to receive threats. Other villagers ostracized the Bhutmanges even more fiercely. Nobody would sell them groceries, and local kids were told to avoid Priyanka. Bhaiya Lal, quiet by nature, grew uneasy about what might happen. He even suggested that maybe the family should leave the village for a while. But Surekha was defiant. She told him they had done nothing wrong. All they did was tell the truth to the police. Why should we run, she argued. Running would only prove the oppressors right. Still, an ominous sense of dread settled over the family. They began to keep to themselves, venturing out only for farm work and necessities. Police patrolling in the village was minimal, despite the known risk of retaliation. In fact, one of the arrested men's relatives openly warned a Dalit activist who visited. "We'll teach them a lesson they'll never forget once our boys are out," he said. And that day was fast approaching. And by the end of September 2006, all 12 of the accused had secured bail. The date was set for September 29th, 2006. On that Friday, the men would walk free pending trial. And now the stage was set for violent retribution. September 29th, 2006. A humid Friday in Khairlanji. The day passed unremarkably for most of the village, but a storm was brewing. By late afternoon, the 12 men who had been arrested for attacking Siddharth had returned to the village after being released on bail. They arrived home seething with a sense of humiliation and rage. They had spent weeks in jail because of, in their mind, that Bhutmange woman and her daughter, those audacious Dalits who dared to complain. As the sun dipped low, these men convened with their friends and kin. Word spread quickly that, quote, "Tonight, the Bhutmanges will pay." Small groups of angry villagers began to gather, fueled by a potent mix of alcohol and hate. Some were relatives of the accused. Others were simply caste peers eager to teach a lesson and reassert their dominance. Around 6:30 or 7 p.m., as dusk fell, a mob of about 30 to 40 villagers converged near the Bhutmange family's isolated hut at the edge of Khairlanji. Torches flickered in the growing darkness as they came from multiple directions, carrying farm tools and improvised weapons. Among them, eyewitnesses later identified many of the men who had been released that day. Also present were other villagers, including women from dominant castes, who egged the men on. It was a carefully calculated show of force. This was not a spontaneous quarrel. It was a planned act of terror.
Aishwarya, folks from our milieu, I would say, young, upper middle class, upper class kids would, watch a movie on slavery like Django Unchained and that Ku Klux Klan scene where the two slaves are attacked by hordes of men in white, that KKK white uniform hurtling towards them to lynch them. And you'd look at that and you'd feel a certain agony, and you'd be able to sort of connect that story to the oppression of black people historically.
Mm-hmm.
This oppression, this mob lynch, that is A, historic, and B, prescient, it still happens,
Mm-hmm.
is one that we don't feel connected to almost.
Yeah, we don't.
It's not one that films we watch portray.
Mm-hmm.
It's not one that folks in our milieu would share on their Instagram stories as and when one happens. It is easy to say, oh my God, young people, look at them caring about foreign issues and not domestic issues. But I think the more fundamental thing is these stories aren't, this is the 200th episode of Desi Crime.
Yeah, they don't exist.
And we are now
Mm-hmm.
covering this story.
Yeah.
I can blame mainstream media for not covering this and therefore it not being in the popular psyche, but we are that mainstream media. And I mean, apart from us, it's just something that it's a story we don't tell.
Yeah, for sure.
I
I also think there are intricacies to these stories that don't get talked about. Like, sure, as those of us who took history and political science in 10th, 11th, 12th, whatever, we remember studying it, we understand the subtle complexities of caste. We've heard it talked about in our family, so we know a little bit about it. We know where we belong, where our peers belong and whatnot. Never did I ever consider that a town with OBCs and Dalits would also face a friction of this kind. In my mind, that's perhaps a good intermingling of, people who experience struggle together and maybe will now create a community of upliftment and love and support. This is absolutely not what I expected. Another intricate detail is we used to talk about in college so much about the intersectional nature of, abuse and the cycle of oppression. And the fact that a Dalit woman will face it so much worse than a Dalit man. It's just, these are the intricacies that, again, they're not talked about enough because it doesn't exist.
I think and again, this is as somebody who is far less educated in this space as he needs to be. And I always tell you, I think caste is one of those spaces where I want to really improve my understanding. And I've tried. I mean, Anurag minus Verma, he's a great writer and sort of reading his material has educated me about this. But I have a lot of work to do. But within the realm of whatever little I know, while Dalits and these castes are social, OBCs is a legal classification. Correct. And so within OBCs, what may fall can be a vast reach within the social hierarchy.
For sure.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but Jats and Gujars also fall within some form of OBC or backward classes.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, but from personal experience with folks belonging to certain castes, we know that lived reality is very different, and they would want to distinguish themselves from, say, Dalits or whatever other backward.
Correct. So
folks within OBCs try to distinguish themselves from the other folks within OBCs. Right. So like it's convoluted. It's intersectional, not in the wokey way that one might think and have that reflexive, oh my God, intersectional. No. It literally, from a very scholastic POV. It is intersectional.
Yeah, 100%. Now, inside the Bhutmange hut, the family must have sensed the danger closing in. The hut itself was small and fragile, quote, nothing more than a heap of loose bricks without mortar, a reporter noted. As the shouts grew louder outside, Surekha bolted the flimsy door and huddled with her children. Priyanka clutched her mother's arm, while Roshan and Sudhir looked at their mother for guidance. They had no firearms, no means of defense beyond a few household tools. A farm sickle, a wrench, a rolling pin, these lay around, but against a mob, they were useless. Through the gaps in the walls, they could see the glow of torches and dozens of figures surrounding their home. Someone yelled, "Drag them out!" Another voice shouted a vile abuse referencing their caste. The children were terrified, and Surekha's heart pounded. She was outnumbered and trapped, but her protective instinct kicked in. In a last, desperate effort, Surekha snatched up a matchbox and a can of kerosene they kept for their lantern. According to one later account, she shouted that if the mob entered, she would set the hut on fire with all of them inside. Perhaps she hoped to scare them off, or at least threatened to deny them their vengeance. She also screamed in Marathi that she would report any attack under the Atrocities Act, referring to the law protecting Dalits. This bold threat only enraged the crowd further. A woman in the mob taunted, "Go ahead and burn. Your screams won't matter." The villagers knew that whether by fire or by blood, the Bhutmanges were going to suffer that night. With a roar, the mob broke down the door. The brick and bamboo barrier collapsed almost instantly under the kicks and blows of at least a dozen men. Dust and smoke filled the one-room hut. What happened next was a scene of pure horror. Men swarmed into the shack and began beating the family mercilessly. Surekha and Priyanka were yanked by their hair and arms and dragged towards the doorway. Sudhir tried to intervene but was smashed across the face with a blunt object, perhaps the butt of an axe or a heavy stick, sending him reeling. Roshan, the partially blind son, stumbled in confusion. He was struck and collapsed wailing. Neighbors who later recounted the incident said the screams that came from that hut that night were unearthly. In those first frenzied moments, Bhaiyalal, the father, managed something miraculous but something that gets a lot of discussion online. Amid the chaos, he slipped away. It's not clear if he had been outside initially or in a corner of the hut, but in all of this confusion and the attack, he was overlooked for a split second. He made the agonizing decision to run, to save his own life and seek help if help could even be found. As he bolted into the darkness of the fields, leaving behind his family's screams, he must have felt torn apart. But had he stayed, he too would most likely have been killed on the spot. Maybe his survival meant he could testify later and bear the eternal burden of witnessing what was to come. The mob back at home dragged Surekha and Priyanka out into the open. Under the dim village streetlight and the mob's torches, mother and daughter were pummeled with fists, sticks, and handles of farm tools. The attackers showed no restraint. Some were heard yelling, "This is what you get for complaining to the police." Somewhere in this violence, a few of the men tore off Surekha's sari and Priyanka's salwar kameez. The two women were stripped completely naked, an act meant to maximize their humiliation. Surekha cried out, trying to cover her daughter's modesty, even as blows came down on them. But the mob was past any humanity. Cycle chains and bullock cart goads, which are basically long iron rods used to prod the cattle, became instruments of torture next. Men swung the rusty chains like whips, the metal hitting their flesh. Others jabbed with the bullock pokers, which tore the women's skin and left deep bruises. Meanwhile, Sudhir and Roshan were dragged outside as well. Bleeding and half-conscious, the brothers were forced to kneel in the dirt. What the mob did next was so depraved that it defies comprehension. They ordered Sudhir to rape his own sister.
No.
Every time when I was reading a description of the attack in its sort of chronological order, I just kept thinking it cannot possibly get worse than this.
What is the source for these? Is this coming from the attacker's testimony later on, or investigators?
Some investigators, some villagers who did end up speaking later on, and who were witness to the attack. Turns out, even though it might be 3 or 4 men at one moment attacking, but there were 40 in total, and then hundreds in the village who were peering out of their windows as these women were dragged across town.
Oh, right.
So a lot of people saw and a lot of people knew what went on. Also, Bhaiyalal was seeing all of this happen. And so he goes on to narrate a lot of it as well.
This description, I'm just, if it was a movie like 12 Years a Slave, it goes on to win an Oscar.
Yeah.
And in India, you make this film and the censor board will first prevent the harshness from coming on the screen.
Yeah.
The news would then say, look at how biased this is.
Yeah.
And by the time you get the film out or any form of coverage out, you've lost the true story, you've lost the hit, and it doesn't get to us. It's easy to blame society for not knowing these stories. The storytellers have an equal burden of getting these out. Now, I'm feeling guilty that this hasn't been told. I'm feeling guilty that you are telling this and I'm not. And I'm feeling guilty that we are telling this 200 episodes on
for sure.
And not now. And it's I mean, this is one of the worst, most gruesome
100%.
crimes we've ever covered.
And to me, you and I have discussed this before, that there is something a little bit nice about mob justice in the kind that we appreciate, when there are these rapists who haven't been held accountable for months on end, and a mob of women comes together and holds them accountable because they've been done wrong for decades on end. There's something that feels kind of nice about it. We don't try and analyze the psyche of mob justice, how a mob comes to incite each other. It's just so baffling to me that there are women in this group and there are families who have other children in this group, and these are backward castes themselves in this group.
The amount of dehumanization required. If one or two people were inflicting this, you could easily write it off as, they're psychopaths. They aren't humane.
There's some Nazi-esque question to be asked here.
Exactly. When 40 do it, the amount of dehumanization you have been able to do towards a certain sect of society, it is, I'm awed by your ability to do it, because I can't believe it. I can't believe you're able to, how perverted one must be one's belief that they can see their fellow human as completely non-human.
The only other time I've seen a group act in this manner towards another human being is this case from the US, and it's this woman whose name is Cheryl Ojo. She died in an accident years after what happened to her, but she had walked into a pub, I think in Kentucky, to buy a packet of cigarettes from the vending machine in the pub, and the men in the pub had locked the door when she entered and gang raped her on the pool table in the pub. And it just, I don't know, something, obviously this story is fueled by hatred towards a community, which that story didn't see. There was no hatred towards a kind of person. It was just depraved men in a pub. But that's the only other time I can compare this to something else I've seen.
And the final thing to add to this is, from the storyteller's responsibility POV, I think you as the audience might find it, I don't know, interesting, but Ash and I realized in sort of telling the story and narrating it that a video like this gets demonetized on YouTube, right? So I can just see all the incentive structures also where you're going, why would I pick this story which deals with inflammatory topics where getting into the weeds of it will clearly get it demonetized. Let me just stick to a regular serial killer story. But I think from time to time we will now cover these stories even though the videos will get demonetized. Otherwise, I mean, who's telling these stories, right? This is not a savior complex thing. It's just an earnest responsibility. If your living is crime storytelling, which is it's our responsibility also to tell more of these. So I hope going forward I will be covering more of these.
For sure. So the mob had now crossed all limits. They had ordered Sudhir to his own sister Priyanka. The idea was to inflict the ultimate shame and trauma before death, to absolutely crush the family's honor. Sudhir, despite his injuries and terror, refused. He would not commit such an unspeakable act, even under the pain of death. Angered by his defiance, several men grabbed Sudhir and Roshan and mutilated their genitals on the spot in public view with knives and sticks. The young men's screams echoed through the night. Villagers later admitted that the entire locality could hear the family's agony. Hundreds of villagers watched from a distance or peered from doorways, but no one intervened. Priyanka and Surekha, now naked and covered in blood, were forced to march through the village lanes, effectively paraded before their neighbors. It was a scene out of humanity's worst nightmares. A mother and daughter stumbling and sobbing, trying to cover themselves as a jeering mob pushed them along, beating them if they slowed. Some in the crowd shouted for more brutality. According to later testimony, a few men called out to the village sarpanch or the headman who was witnessing the spectacle, urging, quote, "Let us them." In this open-air theatre of violence, the sarpanch did nothing to stop the mayhem. He would later blandly claim he was asleep at home and saw nothing. The mob dragged Surekha and Priyanka at an intersection, which some reports call a village chopal or a square. Here, the final acts of violence took place. Multiple attackers gang raped Surekha and Priyanka in full view of the village. The women's cries for help, cries of pain, went unanswered. Dominant caste women in the mob cheered as their men took turns with the helpless women. It was said later that not a single female perpetrator was ever charged. Their higher caste gender granted them impunity, while they encouraged the atrocity. During the assault, the attackers also committed acts of unspeakable torture. They shoved objects, sticks, iron rods, farm tools into the victims' vaginas, essentially disemboweling them. The sheer barbarity was nauseating. Surekha likely died at some point during the from head injuries or shock. Priyanka, younger and fitter, somehow clung to life through the prolonged rape and torture, which might have lasted minutes but felt like hours. Nearby, Sudhir and Roshan were bludgeoned repeatedly. Their skulls were bashed with axes and heavy sticks until they stopped moving. Even after the brothers fell, some men continued to kick and stomp on their broken bodies, spitting on them and shouting caste slurs. By now, the four Bhutmanges were all either dead or dying. Priyanka, barely alive after the gang rape, was strangled with a cycle chain to finish the job. A witness later described how her slender neck bore the deep imprints of chain links, suggesting how brutally they tightened it. Surekha's lifeless body was similarly treated with zero dignity. In the end, the mob had achieved their horrific goal. Surekha, Priyanka, Sudhir and Roshan were all dead. They had been punished in the most sadistic way for the crime of standing up to caste power. Yet the mob was still not done. Even in death, the perpetrators continued to abuse the bodies. Several men kicked at the corpses and used their sticks to toss Sudhir and Roshan's body into a pile as if they were garbage. There was obscene laughter and congratulatory shouting. Before dispersing, the killers knew they had to hide evidence of the crime too. Under the cover of the night, they loaded the four bodies onto a bullock cart. An old cart was procured and the corpses, 2 adult males, an adult female and a teenage girl, were heaped onto it, still nude and bleeding.
Aishwarya, now that I guess their whatever violent trance they were in is kind of dissipating and they're thinking about the aftermath and covering up for the crime, are they not thinking about the husband, the father who managed to escape? Are they not thinking about finding him and killing him because he's a witness who's clearly going to fight?
Yeah, from all reports I read, they weren't. I don't know whether or not they tried to fight him in the frenzy. What I think happened, and I heard just one article talk about this, is that maybe they thought he wasn't there at all, which is why they didn't find him in the beginning, because he was outside the hut, which, as one report suggested.
Okay.
And so they had no idea if he was there, if he witnessed this at all. In their mind, he wasn't there.
Yeah.
He was possibly out in the fields or whatever. There was no attempt made to go and find him after the act.
And I mean, yeah, and okay, I was just kind of numbed right now. When he discovers the bodies, does he not know via the grapevine of what has gone down at his home?
He actually knows all along. So this is a really interesting detail, and we can talk about this later as well, is that he had run away to possibly try and call help, as reports claim online, but he actually never ran away far enough to get help. He just stayed there watching all along, which I don't quite understand that. Maybe he thought the police aren't going to come and help, and so he thought he needs to witness it so he can testify later. I don't know. But he actually never went and called anyone that night. He only goes after he finds the bodies himself now, once the mob goes away. Then he's going to go and get the police. But this is a man who A, ran away, and B, never ran away and got someone for help.
Yeah, I guess both mixed reporting coupled with trauma response.
And not the right chronology of the night as well, maybe.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's just what I know of his actions and his timeline. Now, while the bodies were being taken on this bullock cart, someone fetched a bag of chili powder and unceremoniously threw the spice all over the women's bodies. This was a crude attempt to destroy forensic evidence, with some saying that the villagers believed the chili powder would irritate and presumably obscure semen or other traces, while others said it was just another layer of humiliation. The cart was then driven to the nearby canal, about half a kilometer away. One by one, the bodies were dumped into the canal's black water. The mob likely believed the current would carry them away, but Khairlanji's canal was narrow and often stagnant. The bodies didn't drift very far. Priyanka's corpse caught on some reeds by a bridge, the others floated a short distance downstream. With their deed done now, the mob melted away into the darkness, back to their homes. An eerie silence now fell upon Khairlanji. It was as if the village itself was in shock at the blood that now soaked its soil. But it was a complicit silence, the silence of shared guilt or paralyzing fear. So many had watched or known what happened, yet no one called the authorities that night. No one checked if perhaps someone among the victims still breathed and could be saved. The message had been sent. A Dalit family had been annihilated as a public lesson to all lower castes who might dare to defy the social order. From behind a tree at the edge of a field, Bhaiya Lal, like I said, saw much of this horror unfold. When the mob finally left, Bhaiya Lal crept out to the scene. The square was empty now, littered with broken sticks, pieces of torn clothing, and dark patches of blood on the ground. He was shaking uncontrollably. Gathering courage, he went to the canal, hoping absurdly that someone might have survived. He strained his eyes in the moonlight and saw what looked like a human body floating. Stepping into the cold water, he realized it was Priyanka, but there was no pulse, no breath. She was gone. The others were nowhere in sight. Presumably, they had drifted farther along, he thought. It was now past midnight. Bhaiya Lal knew he had to get help, to tell the police what happened, no matter how powerful the culprits. In a state of shock and panic, he began running to the nearest police outpost, several kilometers away. He was injured, barefoot, stumbling, but he ran, fueled by adrenaline and devastation. By the time he reached the police post, it was the early hours of September 30th, 2006. Bhaiya Lal's nightmare was just beginning, as he would soon confront an indifferent system, even as he reeled from the loss of his family. The massacre of Keralanji had concluded, but the struggle for justice was about to ignite. When Bhaiya Lal burst into the Andhalgaon police station in the pre-dawn hours, he was hysterical. He had run a considerable distance, arriving sweating and smeared in mud and canal water and wailing incoherently about his family being killed. The officers on duty stared at him in disbelief. It was hard to immediately grasp the magnitude of what he was saying. A whole family lynched by a mob in their village. The duty officers knew Bhaiya Lal. They knew he was from a Dalit family that had filed a case recently. Now here he was, claiming that a mob had raped and murdered his wife and children. The initial police response was shockingly sluggish. Accounts suggest that the local police did not rush out in full force upon hearing Bhaiya Lal's report. Perhaps they were uncertain, perhaps afraid to confront a whole village, or perhaps some were sympathetic to the perpetrators. Eventually, as morning broke, a police team did accompany Bhaiya Lal back to Khairlanji. By then, many villagers had already heard rumours of the night's events, yet a conspiracy of silence prevailed. The crime scene, the Bhutmange hut and the village square had been disturbed and partially cleaned. The door was still broken in, but evidence like bloodstains had been haphazardly washed or concealed. Villagers feigned ignorance. One neighbor, when questioned, said, "I don't know what happened. We were at the fields when we heard something." Another insisted, "We were in our house and didn't see anything," claims that rang hollow given the very public nature of the massacre that others confirmed. The entire village closed ranks to protect the killers, or at least protect themselves from retaliation by the killers. Quote, "There is no caste problem now. There was never any caste problem," a group of Khairlanji men would later tell journalists, reflexively downplaying the hate crime. The police's first task was to find the bodies. Bhaiya Lal led them to the canal where he had seen Priyanka, and that's where they recovered her corpse on September 30th. So Rekha and the two sons were found the next day on October 1st, a little further downstream. The delay in retrieving all of the bodies was critical. Every hour that passed was a chance for evidence to deteriorate or be tampered with. And indeed, tampering appeared to have happened. Activists from a social organization who arrived early on took photographs of Priyanka's body before the official postmortem. Those first photos allegedly showed rods and sticks still inserted in her genitals. However, by the time Priyanka's body reached the Mohali Rural Hospital for an autopsy on September 30th, the foreign objects were mysteriously gone. In his report, Dr. A.J. Shende, who conducted the first postmortem, noted, quote, no injuries to the external genitals on Priyanka's body. This was a blatantly false finding given what witnesses and photos described. Somehow, between the crime scene and the autopsy table, vital evidence of sexual violence had been removed. Whether this was due to bribery or pressure on the doctors as later alleged or simply gross incompetence, the result was the same. The rape of Priyanka and Surekha was not officially recorded at that stage. The police investigation in those early days was marked by delay and denial too. Instead of immediately charging the suspects with the full weight of the law, including the Scheduled Castes and Scheduled Tribes Prevention of Atrocities Act, which is meant for exactly such caste-based crimes, the local authorities dragged their feet. They initially treated it as a generic multiple homicide, avoiding any mention of caste or sexual assault. R.R. Patil, the Maharashtra Home Minister, later admitted that there were, quote, initial lapses in the investigation and that the local police showed shocking ineptitude. Those lapses included deliberate inaction. It's reported that police did not promptly secure the crime scene, did not immediately seize the clothing of the suspects, many of whom likely still had blood on them, and did not cordon off the area to prevent villagers from cleaning up evidence. For days, no arrests were made, even though Bhaiyalal had named many attackers in his statement. This inactivity gave the perpetrators time to coordinate their stories and intimidate any potential witnesses. In fact, when Siddharth Gajbhaiya, that family friend who had tried to help, his brother Rajendra tried to speak up about what he knew, since he had phoned Priyanka that very night and she had answered in a panic saying, "They are attacking us," he was allegedly beaten and threatened by the very police officer in charge of the investigation, Inspector A.R. Rajukar. It appeared the local police were more interested in suppressing the truth than uncovering it, likely under pressure from powerful local figures. The narrative that some officials floated was telling. They tried to frame the massacre as a result of an individual dispute or a family feud gone wrong, motivated by revenge alone with nothing to do with caste. This was patently absurd given the dynamics. The only dispute was that a Dalit woman had testified against members of a higher caste. But by pushing caste under the rug, the authorities would avoid invoking the Atrocities Act and thereby downplay the wider social implications. In one instance, an official even circulated baseless rumors that the Bhotmange women might have had Maoist rebel links, a cynical attempt to deflect sympathy by tarring the victims as insurgents. None of it was true, of course, but it indicated how desperately some in power wanted to mask the caste angle of this crime. It fell upon outsiders, activists, journalists, and Dalit organizations to bring facts to light. Independent fact-finding teams quietly travelled to Khairlanji soon after the murders. They interviewed Dalit labourers in the area, scoured the sites, and like I said, took photographs of the disfigured corpses before the state could cover things up.
And Aishwarya, I just want to point out that them wanting to hide the caste angle is not because they don't want to appear as bigoted. It has nothing to do with that.
Right.
It's not that the Atrocities Act has a significantly higher punishment than homicide. It is that if it becomes a caste-based crime, not only will it attract journalists and activists, which will add furor and maybe actually might bring this case to justice in the limelight, it'll also politicize the issue, which will further lead to elements of power that will act against the perpetrators.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, just to sort of clear that up. Yeah.
Now, these photographs that these groups took, showing extensive injuries and nudity of the victims, were circulated among Dalit advocacy networks and put online. One photograph in particular, the one that showed Priyanka's battered body with sticks protruding, was a haunting image that would galvanize many who saw it. The local authorities may have wanted a hush-up, but the truth was leaking out. Meanwhile, Bhaiyalal sat in a daze of grief and frustration. In the span of a day, he had lost his entire family, and now he watched as the system seemed to be failing them again. The government offered him a cheque of rupees 4.5 lakhs in compensation, which is roughly rupees 1.125 lakh per murdered family member. It was the amount mandated by the SC/ST Atrocities Act for victims' kin. But to Bhaiyalal, it felt like pittance for the butchery of his loved ones. What he wanted was not money, he wanted the perpetrators to hang for what they did. He wandered around Khairlanji and nearby towns, meeting anyone who would listen, officials, activists, reporters, and poured out his pain and anger. As one journalist described, quote, his desperate wails, unburdened to anyone willing to listen, echoed in the desolation of Khairlanji's anonymity, end quote. Bhaiya Lal was determined that his family's story would not disappear as, quote, just another crime story in India. And indeed, thanks to his courage and the efforts of allies, the story would soon explode into the public consciousness, albeit after a troubling delay. For almost a month after the massacre, the national media barely took notice of Khairlanji. In the first weeks of October 2006, there were only scant local news reports about a family feud turning deadly in a remote village. The caste atrocity angle was often omitted. It seemed the brutal killing of a Dalit family was passing, quote, through the nation like a whisper, as one reporter later put it. But at the grassroots level, anger was smouldering. Dalit communities across Maharashtra began hearing of what had truly happened. Through Ambedkarite groups, local language pamphlets, and those distributed photographs circulated online. By late October, the pressure was mounting on the state government in Nagpur and Mumbai. The breakthrough in media coverage came from a young journalist named Sabrina Buckwalter, reporting from Nagpur. On October 29, 2006, exactly 1 month after the murders, the Times of India published her investigative feature titled Just Another Rape Story. Sabrina's story was the first in a major English daily to lay out the horrifying details. Her report identified the caste motivation and questioned the silence of the nation. It vividly described the crime scene, noting the chili powder strewn, the red underwear crumpled in a corner, the Buddhist family altar knocked over. It also reported on the cover-up, how evidence of rape, the sticks and the rods, had disappeared by the time of the autopsy, and how police officials were denying that any assault took place despite eyewitness accounts. Buckwalter's piece, aided by ground information from activist Dilip Maske, was a rallying cry. It told India that what happened in Khairlanji was not an isolated crime, but a, quote, classic Indian crime story and a more familiar national shrug, highlighting how routine atrocities against Dalits were ignored. Once the Times of India piece hit and word spread, organizations and students across Maharashtra were galvanized. Protests that had been small and sporadic now grew in scale and intensity. On 19th November 2006, a massive gathering of over 4,000 Dalits assembled at Azad Maidan in Mumbai. Many carried photos of the Bhotmange family or banners with slogans demanding justice. The speakers, activists, retired judges, politicians from Dalit parties thundered against the government's inaction. The demonstration was peaceful but intense, capturing headlines and putting the state authorities on notice. Just a few days later, on 23rd November 2006, protests turned volatile in the city of Nagpur and in the Chandrapur district. Enraged by the lack of arrests and the perceived betrayal by the system, groups of protesters resorted to direct action, blocking roads, burning tires, and some pelting stones at government buildings. In Nagpur, the nerve center of the Dalit movement, also the site of Ambedkar's Diksha Bhumi, tensions ran high. Police were deployed in force. Clashes erupted as the police lathi charged the crowd to disperse them. Several protesters and police were injured. The Maharashtra government, led by Chief Minister Vilas Rao Deshmukh, was jolted into finally responding. Deshmukh announced an ex gratia compensation package for Bhaiya Lal, rupees 6 lakhs plus a job and a plot of land on top of what he was already offered. The government also promised action. They declared that the investigation was being handed over to the Central Bureau of Investigation, the CBI, an implicit admission that the local police had botched the case. Indeed, 5 policemen who had mishandled the early investigation were not only suspended but dismissed from service in November, a rare and significant punitive step. However, the anger on the ground did not subside easily. In late November, an incident unrelated to Khairlanji further flamed passions. The desecration of a statue of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar in Uttar Pradesh on November 24th triggered an emotional outburst among Dalits in Maharashtra.
6 districts of Maharashtra as Dalit anger spilled over to the streets that triggered the desecration of a statue of Dr. Ambedkar in Kanpur yesterday. By the evening, 2 people had lost their lives.
Violent protests swept through towns in Vidarbha and Marathwada regions. Trains were stopped, buses torched. In Mumbai's suburbs of Deonar, protesters even set a train compartment on fire. The state government and media linked the escalating violence to Khairlanji as a root cause of Dalit frustration. The Maharashtra Chief Minister and Mumbai's Police Commissioner both acknowledged that Khairlanji's injustice had fueled the fury enveloping the state. Under such pressure, the wheels of justice began to turn. The CBI formally took over the Khairlanji case and filed a comprehensive charge sheet in December 2006. They charged 11 people with murder, conspiracy, unlawful assembly with weapons, and outraging the modesty of women. Notably, Rape charges were absent, reflecting the difficulty of proving it after the evidence tampering, and also reflecting a broader reluctance in the justice system to acknowledge caste-based sexual violence. The CBI did, however, mention that they were probing the roles of many others. By this time, most of the main suspects were finally in custody, having been rearrested after the protests erupted. The net of accountability was inching wider. Even that sitting MLA, Madhukar Kokade, was questioned for his alleged interference. Activists demanded that the SC/ST's Atrocities Act be applied to the case to recognize the caste motivation, which would make the penalties harsher. With all of these slow changes, by mid-2007, order had largely been restored in Maharashtra, but the legacy of Khairlanji's uprising lingered. The state government, embarrassed and chastened, quietly ensured that the court case was fast-tracked for trial. Bhaiyalal, while still grief-stricken, expressed a measure of hope seeing the public support. Quote, "At least now people know what happened. My family's sacrifice has shaken Maharashtra," he told reporters. The stage was set for the courtroom battle that would follow under the watchful gaze of an awakened public. The criminal trial for the Khairlanji Massacre began in 2007 in a special fast-track court in the Bhandara district. Public prosecutor Ujjwal Nikam, a renowned lawyer known for handling high-profile cases, was appointed to lead the prosecution. Nikam was determined to secure the maximum punishment for the killers, calling Khairlanji one of the most heinous crimes he had ever encountered. On the other side, the accused had mustered a team of defense lawyers who floated the familiar argument that the mob's actions were not premeditated but done in the heat of the moment, and that the accused had otherwise clean records. It was an attempt to downplay the savagery as a one-time lapse. The evidence laid out by the prosecution was damning, though. Bhaiyalal testified as the star witness, recounting in detail how a mob of his neighbors had brutalized and killed his family while hurling caste abuses. His testimony was heart-wrenching. The courtroom fell silent as he described what he saw from behind a tree. Independent witnesses like members of the fact-finding teams and some villagers, mostly Dalits from nearby villages since Khairlanji's own residents largely kept silent, corroborated aspects of the incident. The prosecution presented forensic evidence, the autopsy reports noting the cause of death and photographs showing the injuries. However, due to the earlier forensic tampering, there was an evidentiary gap regarding rape. The trial judge and later higher courts would latch onto this gap to the frustration of many. Still, the brutality of the crime was evident and overwhelming. And then, in September 2008, nearly 2 years after the massacre, the trial court had its verdict. 8 men were found guilty of murder and other charges. Their names were Gopal Sakru Binjevar, Shatrughan Dhande, Vishwanath Dhande, Prabhakar Mandlekar, Jagdish Mandlekar, Ramu Dhande, and Shishupal Dhande. These were indeed the core perpetrators identified by Bhaiyalal and others, members of just a few families that had led the mob, with 3 other accused being acquitted for the lack of sufficient evidence. Shockingly, among those acquitted was one main culprit, widely believed to be Bhaskar Kadav, the man with political connections. His alibi, that he was away at a bank during the incident, was accepted to the outrage of Bhaiyalal, who insisted that Bhaskar was part of the mob. Many in the Dalit community saw this as proof that influential masterminds had escaped justice. When it came to sentencing, Special Judge S.S. Das did not mince words about the barbarity of the crime. On 24th September 2008, he pronounced the death penalty for 6 of the 8 convicts and life imprisonment for the remaining 2. The courtroom was tense that day. The convicts stood trembling as the judge declared their acts rarest of the rare, warranting capital punishment. It was one of the few instances in India where multiple death sentences were awarded for a caste atrocity. Outside the courthouse, a large crowd had gathered. Dalit activists, media onlookers. When news of the death sentence broke, many cheered and clapped, seeing it as a measure of long-awaited justice. Bhaiyalal, who had been stoic throughout the trial, quietly told reporters that he was satisfied that the killers of his family would face the ultimate punishment. However, even in this moment of judicial victory, there were points of contention. The judge's verdict notably did not apply the Scheduled Caste Scheduled Tribes POA Act. The reasoning given was that the massacre was not proven in court as a caste crime, but rather an act of revenge over a police complaint. This reasoning troubled many observers. As one legal commenter put it, the court seemed to adopt caste-blind lenses, ignoring the very evident caste-based motivations in order to treat the case as a simple vendetta. In effect, the judiciary, at least at the trial level, upheld the state's initial narrative of an individual dispute. Nevertheless, with the death sentences on the books, it felt to Dalit protesters that some justice had been done. Still, though, the case was far from over. In India, any death sentence is subject to mandatory confirmation by the High Court, and the convicts are entitled to appeal. The 8 convicted men appealed to the Nagpur bench of the Bombay High Court, and the state also filed an appeal seeking confirmation of the death penalties. Hearings in the High Court took place in the early 2010, with Justice A.P. Lavande and R.C. Chavan presiding. Over multiple sessions, the High Court scrutinized every aspect: the evidence of premeditation, whether the crime met the rarest of rare threshold for death, and crucially, whether caste hatred was the motive. On 14 July 2010, the High Court delivered a judgment that would reopen old wounds. The court commuted the death sentence of all 6 condemned prisoners to 25 years of rigorous punishment, essentially a fixed long-term life sentence, and likewise set 25 years as the sentence for the 2 who already had life terms. In practical terms, this meant all 8 convicts would serve at least 25 years in prison. A severe punishment, but far short of the death penalty.
Aishwarya, I am against the death penalty.
Yes, we have discussed that.
But if you have death penalty for the rarest of rare, the
This
most
is it.
brutal of cases, I don't see any other.
Yeah,
This is it. Like if you as a state have recognized that, okay, this is a fair means of punishing the most violent atrocity that can be committed. This is the most violent atrocity, one of the most that I've come across. And then
100%.
on what basis are you commuting? If this doesn't meet the rarest of rare bar, then what does?
What does? Only terrorists? Like, I don't understand. It's not
Nonsense.
it. Yeah.
Nonsense. Yeah, it's like it's like the rarest of rare is reserved for when the media makes it that big. You know, you have Nirbhaya, you have Ajmal, you have all these. No, it's rarest of rare in terms of the brutality conferred onto the individual, not how much the media is talking about it. You know, the judiciary should be separate from what the media's opinion is. Great death penalty wasn't given, but you're not taking it away systematically, which is what I want. If you're keeping it, these are the people
These
that
are the
deserve
people
it.
who should get it. I agree. But the High Court judges justified this decision by stating that the murders, while heinous, were an act of revenge and not motivated by the victim's caste. They explicitly stated that the attack was retaliation for Surekha and Priyanka's police testimony and not a general anti-Dalit hate crime. It has now been nearly 2 decades since the Khairlanji Massacre. The wheels of justice, though turning slowly, did turn. After the 2010 High Court verdict, the case was indeed brought before the Supreme Court of India. In 2019, the Supreme Court delivered its final judgment, bringing some closure to the legal saga. The apex court upheld the convictions of the 8 accused and the 25-year prison sentences, dismissing the appeals of both the CBI, which had sought the death penalty, and the convicts, who had sought acquittal or reduction. It also endorsed the concept of a 25-year term without remission, noting that life imprisonment normally means the remainder of life, but can be structured as a minimum fixed term in special cases. Thus, barring any extraordinary developments, the perpetrators of Khairlanji will remain behind bars until at least 2031, after which they'll have spent a quarter century locked away. Tragically, Bhaiya Lal did not live to see this final affirmation of justice. On January 20th, 2017, at the age of 62, Bhaiya Lal suffered a heart attack and passed away. Those close to him say he died a broken man. The years after 2006 were a lonely struggle. He had moved out of Keralanji soon after the incident, unable to stay in that village where his family was butchered. The government had given him a job as a low-level peon in a government office as part of the compensation, and he took it, quietly doing clerical tasks in the Bhandara district. The 5-acre plot of land that his wife Surekha had so passionately defended was eventually left fallow. Bhaiya Lal leased it out to non-Dalit farmers because he couldn't tend to it alone and feared attracting trouble if he tried. He lived modestly, channeling his energy into the legal case. Though the High Court's refusal to see caste had wounded him, he derived some solace from how Khairlanji had sparked a movement. In a sense, his family's martyrdom awakened many to the ongoing plight of Dalits. On the policy front, Khairlanji prompted at least some introspection. In its aftermath, there was pressure on the government to better enforce the SC/ST Atrocities Act. The act itself was strengthened in later years, in 2015 and 2018, to widen the definition of atrocities and curb misuses of power by officials. And what of Surekha, Priyanka, Sudhir and Roshan? They have not been forgotten. Across India, especially in Dalit circles, their names are remembered as symbols in a struggle against caste violence. In a quiet corner of what was once the Bhutmange farm, local Dalit supporters erected a small memorial pillar a few years after the incident. Inscribed on it are the names Surekha, Priyanka, Sudhir and Roshan, and the date 29 September 2006. It stands there amid the crops, almost unnoticed. But every year on that date, people come, some from nearby towns, some from far, to lay flowers, light candles, and pledge that they will not let Indian society forget what happened in Khairlanji. It is at once a tribute to the lost and a quiet protest against the system. As one visitor said during the 2025 gathering at the memorial, in remembering them, we remember all the nameless who suffer. Khairlanji should have changed India. There is still time. Let it change now.
If you like what we do here at Desi Studios and absolutely love what we're wearing today, this is merch you can go buy all for yourself.
You can buy this Desi Crime merch in our YouTube store on the link down below at Karak Merch. Keep the engines at Desi Studios rolling so we can pay our videographer right behind the camera to make these amazing